Sure, a lot of people in the room will remember certain aspects of what happened with News of the World and phone hacking and what happened around that time, but perhaps you could give us like a short potted version of the key events and maybe the chronology.
So most people, when I say where I used to work, I left last June to set up on my own, know the name and usually have some form of reaction to it, mostly negative if I'm honest, which usually starts with how on earth could you work there. So, I mean, it really was interesting, even for the preparation for this, to go back and think, well, where did it start, I suppose, really. If you don't know the history, in 2009, two rogue journalists who worked for News were pleaded guilty to phone hacking. The PCC in 2009 reported that they had no evidence that they'd been misled on phone hacking. In 2011, the MSC was established, which was a separate identity which was looking into what had happened, and they handed over quite a substantial amount of documents to the police and evidence. Later that year, April 2011, News International, as it was then, admitted phone hacking and apologised. And that was quickly followed in July by the fact that there was reports that Millie Dowler, if you remember, the young lady that was missing, whether her phone had been hacked and whether that had actually interfered with the police investigation. And that really spoke to the nation in terms of what people felt passionate about and what they would go up in arms about. And that's the point at which we had cameras outside the front of the door every day. Shortly after that, a decision was made, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how that played out, but on 7th of July 2011, the News of the World was announced was closing, and as a HR function, we had to make quite a lot of people redundant without any planning. That was followed by Rebecca Brooks, who was our CEO at that time, resigning and being arrested shortly afterwards. In November of that year, the first journalist was actually approached by the police, and by approached I mean they arrived at his door, about 10 of them, in the morning when his family were still at home, pulled up his floorboards and searched his house, including his children's bedrooms, because they felt at that point that there were, in the evidence they'd been handed, evidence that journalists essentially had paid people in public office for information, and that's what they were looking for. Between 2011 and 2013, 24 Sun journalists were arrested, and on the inside, of course, that was something we had no control over. It's something that played out very publicly, and we would find out as it was happening. The first Sun journalist took 3 years to come to trial. So from the point of having that knock on the door to actually knowing their fate and what it meant for them, they waited 3 years, unknown essentially what would happen to them. The result of all of that investigation, there were multiple police investigations, was that there was one guilty conviction for handling a stolen phone, which actually wasn't really in the remit of Elvedon when it started, but that was one of the results. I found an amazing statistic when I was doing my research that actually from the first day that some reporter was arrested to the actual end of the process, it was 1,819 days. So you can imagine what that was like for people who had uncertainty for such a length of time.
What was your role, and what were the sort of main challenges of it?
So the day of the News of the World closure, I was walking onto the commercial floor because we didn't expect it. We knew things were bad. I don't think we actually thought they were that bad. I was working as part of the leadership team in commercial at that point, and I looked up and saw my MD sprint towards me. This is not a man that sprinted. He was full of I suppose, vigour. He was full of passion and proudness, but he's also someone who took things in his stride, and I knew something was going on for him to run. All he said, as he looked at me in a very sort of strange way, was get everybody together now, round my desk. And as we all approached his desk, as he stood there, as he started to talk, it came up on the ticker tape that the News of the World were closing. So when I say we had no planning time, I'm not exaggerating. We didn't know it was coming, and we told people as we knew, which was as it was going live. Now, of course, we're a news organisation, so that was deliberate, but in terms of the human impact, it meant people didn't have time to prepare. I worked as part of the commercial team during that period to help them think about how to talk to media agencies and clients about whether they wanted to buy advertising from a dirty organisation. That was a word that was often used. And I was part of the HR team that had to make 700 people redundant with no plan. And at that point, I think if you'd have asked us, we couldn't have even told you if you worked for us, because there's quite complicated employment relationships in newspapers. As things evolved, we had to move key personnel around, and I got parachuted into the Sun at the point that the Elvedon story was playing out, and was part of the sort of business for 3 years, who then tried to sort of choreograph the conversations we needed to have, when we needed to have them, think about and scenario plan what was possible and could happen. We often missed the thing that did happen. I always remember that we were planned for one of the trials, and the one thing we hadn't thought about was a hung jury, and that's exactly what happened. And so suddenly you've got to have a new plan that you haven't considered. And I suppose really just think about all the people who were impacted, whether that was directly or were sitting and watching this play out in the organisation.
So tell us a bit about how it felt to you personally, and you know, I suppose also what kind of coping strategies you had for dealing with this kind of extreme situation.
Well, you know, when I get people ask me this quite a lot. I mean, I was an employee too, so I overnight went from being proud to embarrassed to work there, and I just don't think you can underestimate what that's like for staff. When you go home, and I had my mum say to me, "You can't work there anymore. Can you resign tomorrow?" That's what I expect, and that's what I want. I'm not okay with this. So, you know, not only are you dealing with your own shame of where you work and what they did and how that makes you feel, you're also having to kind of be in situations with people that you really care about, where they think it's okay to tell you what you should do. So for me, I think, you know, seeing the personal damage that was done to human beings whose lives were thrown up in the air because of what was happening to them directly, but also knowing that you had your own shame around that and were trying to balance that with what was going on, because my shame is nowhere near the experience that they had, and how dare I feel like that when they're going through that. So there's lots of really sort of complex emotions that I found really difficult. And that meant I had to do my own work on how I was, I suppose, really, and I can talk more about that. I also think you can't underestimate the complexity of this. So it happened over 10 years, this was going on. There were 8 police investigations, which really extended far beyond the reach of News UK. At points, you know, the impact was huge. I mean, I looked at some of my paperwork, and there were points during that when half of our news desks were affected in some way or form. And so if you think about functions in your businesses and you look at key functions that you rely on every day and think half of them wouldn't be there, what would happen then? And you just couldn't prepare. You know, you could plan, and we did plan. You think, right, what will happen next, and what would that mean, and where does that look like? You're always trying to think ahead. But we constantly faced situations we hadn't planned for, because I just don't think it was possible to plan for all those options. So you had to be prepared to move quick when things happened.
What your advice would be to firms when recruiting, when there's a crisis, in terms of being open with candidates, and also being open with partners such as recruitment agencies, and what's the dangers to the employer brand if you don't do that?
Good question.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have journalists leave. If you look at journalists, I suppose, we didn't really have them leave our organisation, but we had them be not in the business because they were doing other things. So I think that meant that we had to be more creative about where we recruited from. So print journalists are very traditional in they'll say, I'll only hire other print journalists who've been in a national title and have at least done it for X amount of years. There's a real sort of, you know, you do this and then you do this and you do this. And certainly we had to challenge that perception, because there weren't people to hire. And if we did find them, so we might, you know, our search might find someone that we thought would be really good as a particular reporter. If we approached them and said, do you want to come and work for us? They'd say, no, why would I want to come there? So we had to challenge people to be creative about what good looked like and take more chances. So we couldn't always rely on the fact that we would be able to hire someone that'd been there and done it and got the t-shirt. We had to say, well, they have done media journalism, for example, and we think they could probably translate to print journalism. So now we need to launch a massive campaign to lure them over here and say how fabulous we are. So we would try and get loads of journalists involved in that. So we had to work much harder to sell our product and our business to people to get them to come.
HR is traditionally seen as quite ethically correct, or at least within the bounds of being legal. How did what was going on conflict with anything in your own kind of ethics? Because there's obviously a conflict, because obviously you have to toe the company line. There's a corporate policy that's coming on from high, as well as locally as well within the business. How did you deal with that own internal conflict?
Well, it's kind of back to the question about what do I say to my mum, which is, are you okay working there? And if you go, I think for me, I went through the, well, am I okay working there? Well, yes, if I'm part of the solution. If I'm going to stay because I think the people who are involved in this deserve to be treated with respect, and that I'm going to be part of the team that tries to help us get better, then I'm in. And essentially that's the judgment call I made, which is I'm in because I think I can do something to help this. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but I've been around this organisation for quite a while. I know a lot of people. I think they could trust me over someone else. And whilst I haven't done this before, actually I'm probably well placed to be able to help people. You know, I think all of us are in organisations where we have to make choices every day about what we're prepared to do and what we're not. And we all get faced with very senior people saying, do that. And sometimes the answer is no. And I'm no different than that.
That's the end of our season for London HR Connection. So we have August off for good behaviour. Our next event we're just planning for September the 20th, which will be focusing on diversity and inclusion. So further details will be up on the website soon. But I hope you enjoyed this evening and do stay with us.